The dinner rush at Bellini's was in full swing. White-clothed tables filled the elegant dining room, and the soft murmur of conversation mixed with the gentle clink of silverware against fine china. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over everything, making even the most ordinary faces look somehow more important, more worthy of the $100 steaks they were cutting into. Grace moved between the tables with practiced efficiency, balancing a tray of dirty dishes in one hand while smiling at a customer who was trying to get her attention with the other. She had been on her feet for nearly 10 hours already, having picked up a lunch shift when another server called in sick. Her back ached, her feet were screaming, and she still had at least 3 more hours before she could go home. "Just a moment, sir," she said to the impatient man at table 7, nodding to show she'd seen him. She quickly dropped off the dirty dishes at the kitchen station and grabbed a pitcher of ice water before heading back to his table. "Sorry for the wait," she said, refilling his glass with a smile that didn't quite reach her tired eyes. "How was your meal?" "The steak is overcooked," the man said without looking up at her. "I asked for medium rare. This is medium at best." Grace nodded sympathetically, though she could see the meat was still pink in the center. "I'm so sorry about that. Would you like me to take it back to the kitchen?" The man seemed to consider it, then shook his head. "No time, I have a meeting in an hour. Just make sure it's noted for next time." "Of course, sir. Is there anything else I can get for you?" When he shook his head again, Grace moved on to her next table, where a family was celebrating a birthday. The contrast was striking. Here were people actually enjoying themselves, laughing and sharing stories while the businessman ate alone, his attention focused on his phone rather than his meal or his surroundings. As she took their dessert order, Grace felt a familiar twinge in her chest. Once she had imagined a very different life for herself. A life where she wasn't on her feet all day serving others, where her talents were recognized and valued. A life where she could pursue her passion without worrying about whether the electricity bill would get paid. But life had a way of redirecting dreams. First her father's long illness and the medical bills that came with it. Then her acceptance to the conservatory, followed almost immediately by the realization that even with a partial scholarship, she couldn't afford to go. And now her mother's diagnosis, which had pushed music even further down on her list of priorities. "Grace," Thomas, the restaurant manager, called from near the kitchen. "Table 12 needs attention." "It's Mr. Wells." Grace felt her stomach tighten. Richard Wells was one of Bellini's most regular and most demanding customers. A real estate developer whose name appeared on half the new buildings downtown. He was known for his exacting standards and generous tips. The latter made him popular with the staff, even if his particular requests and occasional impatience made him challenging to serve. "Coming right away," she called back, quickly finishing with the birthday family before making her way to table 12. Wells was sitting alone, as he often did when he came in during the week. Weekends were different. Then he would bring business associates or the occasional date, though there had been fewer of those in recent years. Tonight he was in his usual dark suit, silver hair perfectly combed, steel gray eyes scanning the menu despite the fact that he ordered the same thing almost every time. "Good evening, Mr. Wells," Grace said, approaching the table with a fresh basket of bread. "It's nice to see you again." He looked up, and for a brief moment his stern expression softened into something almost like recognition. "You're new," he said, though Grace had served him at least a dozen times over the past year. "I've been here about 3 years now," she corrected him gently. "Would you like your usual Cabernet, or would you prefer something different tonight?" The fact that she remembered his preferred wine seemed to please him. "The Cabernet will be fine," he said with a nod. As Grace turned to get his wine, she caught sight of the baby grand piano that sat in the corner of the restaurant. It was mostly for show these days, played only on special occasions when the owner hired a musician to entertain the guests. The rest of the time it sat silent, a beautiful but forgotten piece of furniture that most customers barely noticed, but Grace noticed it. Every time she worked a shift, her eyes would find their way to that piano at least once or twice. Sometimes during slow periods she would imagine walking over to it, sitting down and placing her hands on the keys. In her mind, she could almost feel the cool ivory beneath her fingers, hear the rich tones that would fill the restaurant if she were to play. She had been 5 years old when she first touched a piano, at a neighbor's house where her mother cleaned on weekends. The neighbor lady had found her sitting at the instrument, picking out a simple melody she had heard on the radio. Instead of scolding her for touching something so expensive, the woman had been delighted, telling Grace's mother that the child had a gift. Lessons had followed, not with expensive private teachers, but with a music student from the local college who charged next to nothing because he saw something special in the way Grace played. By the time she was 12, she was winning local competitions. By 16, her teachers were talking about scholarships and music schools and a future filled with possibility. And then her father got sick, and everything changed. "Miss?" Wells' voice brought her back to the present. She realized she had been standing at the bar, lost in thought for far too long. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Wells," she said, quickly grabbing a bottle of his preferred wine from the rack. "Just a moment." As she hurried back to his table, she noticed his gaze following her with unusual intensity. Had he seen her staring at the piano? Was he going to complain to Thomas about her distraction? The last thing she needed was to lose this job. Her mother's medical bills were already piling up, and the night nurse who stayed with her when Grace worked evenings wasn't cheap. "Here you are," she said, presenting the bottle for his approval before opening it. He nodded, and she poured a small amount for him to taste. Wells took a sip, his expression thoughtful. "It's fine," he said after a moment. As she filled his glass, he asked, "Do you play?" The question caught her off guard. "Play? The piano," he said, gesturing toward the instrument in the corner. "I noticed you looking at it earlier, and just now at the bar, your fingers were moving slightly as if playing keys." Grace felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. She hadn't realized her thoughts had been so obvious, or that he had been watching her so carefully. "I used to," she admitted, seeing no point in denying it. "A long time ago." Wells nodded as if confirming something to himself. "I thought so. There's a certain way musicians look at instruments, not just seeing them but hearing them in their minds." He took another sip of his wine. "Why did you stop?" The question was personal, almost intrusive, but there was no judgment in his voice, only curiosity. For some reason, Grace found herself answering honestly. "Life happened," she said with a small shrug. "My dad got sick when I was 18, cancer, the medical bills. Well, choices had to be made, and now my mom has the same thing." She forced a smile. "But I'm lucky to have this job. The hours work with her treatment schedule, and the tips are good." Wells studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he simply nodded and opened his menu. "I'll have the filet medium rare with the roasted potatoes and asparagus." "Excellent choice," Grace said, relieved to be back on the familiar ground of taking orders rather than discussing her personal life. "Would you like to start with a salad or appetizer?" "The soup of the day will be fine." Grace wrote down his order and moved away from the table, wondering why she had shared so much with him. There was something in his manner that invited confidence, despite his reputation for being demanding and sometimes abrupt. As the evening progressed, she found herself glancing at his table more often than was strictly necessary. He ate methodically, his attention divided between his meal and a small notebook in which he occasionally wrote something. Once or twice she caught him looking at the piano again, a slight frown on his face as if it bothered him somehow. The restaurant grew busier as the night went on. A large party arrived without a reservation, and Thomas had to rearrange several tables to accommodate them. The kitchen fell behind on orders, leading to impatient customers and frazzled servers. Through it all, Grace kept moving, smiling, apologizing for delays she couldn't control, all while her feet throbbed and her back protested every tray she lifted. During a rare quiet moment, as she was arranging clean silverware for a new table setting, she found her gaze drawn once again to the piano. Without meaning to, she began to hum softly to herself. Debussy's Clair de Lune, one of the pieces she had been preparing for her conservatory audition all those years ago. Her fingers moved slightly as they arranged the knives and forks, following the melody in her mind. "You should play it." The voice startled her. She turned to find Wells standing nearby, his bill paid, watching her with that same intense expression. "Excuse me," she said, not sure she had heard him correctly. "The piano," he said, gesturing toward it. "You should play it. That piece you were humming, Debussy, isn't it? I'd like to hear it." Grace stared at him, momentarily speechless. Was he serious? She couldn't just walk over and start playing the piano in the middle of her shift. Could she? I'm working, Mr. Wells, she said finally. I can't just... I've already spoken to your manager. Wells interrupted, nodding toward Thomas, who was watching them with a curious expression from near the host stand. He's agreed to let you take a short break. Consider it a special request from a valued customer. Before Grace could respond, he walked away, heading not toward the exit as she had expected, but directly to a table near the piano. He sat down, folded his hands in front of him, and looked at her expectantly. Grace stood frozen, the silverware still in her hands, as every instinct in her body told her to run in the opposite direction. Play the piano? Here now? After not touching a keyboard in months? It was ridiculous, impossible, and yet some small, long-buried part of her was already walking toward the instrument, already imagining the feel of the keys, already hearing the music in her mind. She looked over at Thomas, who gave her an encouraging nod and a subtle thumbs up. Then her eyes swept across the restaurant, where several customers had noticed the unusual exchange and were watching with interest, and finally back to Wells, who sat waiting with the patience of someone who was used to getting what he wanted, no matter how unusual the request might be. The evening had started like any other at Bellini's, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the heart of downtown. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over white tablecloths and polished silverware. The soft murmur of conversations mixed with the gentle clink of wine glasses created the perfect atmosphere for the wealthy patrons who frequented the establishment. For Grace, it was just another Friday night of running between tables, taking orders, and forcing smiles even when her feet felt like they might fall off. She had been working at Bellini's for almost 3 years now. The pay was decent, especially with tips, and the flexible hours allowed her to care for her mother, whose medical bills had been piling up since her diagnosis last year. "Table 12 needs more wine," hissed Ricky, the head waiter, as he rushed past with a tray of appetizers. Grace nodded and quickly made her way to the wine station. As she filled a crystal decanter with an expensive Cabernet, she couldn't help but glance at the baby grand piano that sat in the corner of the dining room. It was mostly for show these days, though occasionally the restaurant would hire a musician for special events. Grace had a complicated relationship with that piano. Every time she walked past it, her fingers would tingle with the memory of keys beneath them. She had been playing since she was 5, with a natural talent that had impressed everyone who heard her. Her piano teacher had once told her mother that Grace had the kind of gift that comes along once in a generation. But dreams of music schools and concert halls had evaporated when her father left and the family savings went with him. "Grace, the wine!" Ricky's voice snapped her back to reality. She realized she had been standing there, lost in thought, while the expensive wine overflowed the decanter. Quickly she mopped up the spill and hurried to table 12. Mentally calculating how much that mistake would cost her if the manager noticed. "Here's your wine." "Sir?" she said politely to the older gentleman who barely looked up from his conversation. Grace was used to being invisible to the customers. That was part of the job. Efficient service without intruding on their experience. As she moved to her next table, the front doors opened, and the entire staff seemed to straighten up all at once. Grace followed their gaze and immediately understood why. Richard Wells had just walked in. Wells wasn't just any customer. He was a real estate mogul whose net worth was rumored to be in the billions. He owned half the skyscrapers downtown and had recently been featured on the cover of Forbes. At Bellini's, his arrival always created a stir, partly because he was known to be incredibly generous with tips, but also because his temper was legendary. The restaurant manager, Thomas, practically ran to greet him. "Mr. Wells, what an unexpected pleasure. Your usual table is currently occupied, but I can have it cleared immediately." "That won't be necessary," Wells interrupted, his voice calm but commanding. "Any table will do." He was dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Grace's yearly rent. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and his posture was that of someone who had spent a lifetime being in charge. Behind him stood 3 other people, a younger man carrying a leather portfolio who looked like an assistant, and a couple who seemed important, judging by their designer clothes and the woman's diamond necklace that caught the light with every movement. Thomas led them to a table in Grace's section, and her heart sank a little. Serving Wells meant walking on eggshells all night. He was known for sending back dishes if they weren't perfect, and asking detailed questions about the wine, selection that Grace sometimes struggled to answer. "Good evening," she said with her best professional smile as she approached their table. Welcome to Bellini's. May I start you with some drinks? Wells looked up at her, his steel gray eyes studying her face for a moment before he spoke. The 2010 Chateau Margaux, please. Grace nodded, jotting it down. The wine cost over $200 a bottle. And water for the table. Sparkling for me. Still for everyone else? He added, not bothering to consult his companions. As Grace turned to leave, she heard the woman with the diamonds whisper something about the piano. Wells glanced at the instrument and then back to his menu without comment. When Grace returned with the wine, she noticed that Wells seemed distracted. He barely participated in the conversation at his table, instead looking around the restaurant with an expression she couldn't quite read. As she carefully poured his wine, he suddenly addressed her. "How long have you worked here?" The question caught her off guard. "Almost 3 years, sir," she replied. He nodded slowly, then returned to his menu. "I'll have the seared scallops to start, then the filet, medium rare." The rest of the table ordered, and Grace hurried to put it in the system. Throughout the first course, she noticed that Wells continued to seem preoccupied. He ate only half his scallops and kept glancing toward the piano. At one point, she caught him watching her as she served another table nearby. "Is everything all right with your meal, Mr. Wells?" she asked when she came to clear the appetizer plates. "The food is fine," he said, though his tone suggested something was bothering him. The main courses arrived, and Grace made sure everything was perfect before placing them on the table. Wells's filet was cooked exactly to his specifications, but he barely touched it. Instead, he sipped his wine and continued his strange surveillance of the restaurant. During a quiet moment, Grace found herself standing near the dessert station, which gave her a clear view of the baby grand. Without thinking, she let her gaze linger on it a little too long, her mind drifting to the piece she had been practicing before her mother got sick, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor. Her fingers moved slightly at her sides, muscle memory taking over. When she turned around, she found Wells staring directly at her. Their eyes met for a brief, uncomfortable moment before she quickly looked away and busied herself with polishing already clean glasses. As the evening progressed, the restaurant grew busier and louder. Grace was running between tables, filling water glasses, bringing extra bread, and checking on customers. She nearly collided with another server as they both tried to navigate the narrow space between tables. "Sorry," she muttered, steadying herself against a chair. When she looked up, she realized it was Wells's chair, and he was watching her with that same intense expression. "Careful," he said, his voice neither kind nor unkind, simply observant. "I'm so sorry, sir," Grace said, feeling her cheeks flush with embarrassment. When it came time for dessert, Wells's party ordered the restaurant's famous chocolate soufflé, which took 20 minutes to prepare. While they waited, his companions excused themselves one by one, the assistant to make a phone call, the couple to greet friends at another table. Wells sat alone, swirling the last of his wine in his glass. Grace was arranging dessert forks at a nearby table when she heard the first few notes from the piano. She turned to see one of the restaurant's regular weekend customers, an elderly woman who sometimes played a little when she'd had too much to drink, pressing the keys randomly. The discordant sounds made several diners look up with annoyed expressions. Thomas quickly approached the woman and gently suggested she return to her table, which she did with a good-natured laugh. As the awkward moment passed, Grace noticed Wells watching the piano with a frown. When she brought the soufflés to his table, his companions had returned. The conversation had turned to some real estate development deal, but Wells seemed uninterested. He took one bite of his dessert, then set down his spoon. "Is the soufflé not to your liking, sir?" Grace asked, concerned that something was wrong with the food. "It's fine," he said, then hesitated before adding, "You keep looking at the piano." Grace felt a jolt of panic. Had he noticed her staring at it all evening? Had she been that obvious? I'm sorry if I've been distracted, sir," she stammered. "Do you play?" he asked, cutting straight to the point. The direct question in front of his entire party made her uncomfortable. The assistant looked up from his portfolio with curiosity, and the couple paused their conversation to listen. "I used to," Grace admitted, trying to keep her voice professional and detached. "A long time ago," Wells nodded as if confirming a suspicion. "I thought so. I noticed your hands earlier. You have a pianist's fingers." He gestured to her hands, which were holding a water pitcher. "And the way you watch that piano. It's not casual interest. You miss it, Grace wasn't sure how to respond. It felt too personal, too revealing to discuss with a customer, especially one like Wells. I should check on my other tables, she said politely, trying to retreat. Of course, Wells said, but his eyes followed her as she moved away. As the evening began winding down, Wells' party paid their bill, with an extremely generous tip that made Grace's eyes widen when she saw it, and prepared to leave. The assistant was helping the woman with her coat when Wells suddenly remained seated. You go ahead, he told them. I have something I need to take care of. I'll see you all tomorrow. They looked surprised but didn't question him. As they left, Wells signaled to Thomas, who hurried over immediately. Is there something else I can get for you, Mr. Wells? The manager asked. Yes, Wells said, his voice decisive. I want that waitress to play the piano. Thomas looked confused. I'm sorry? Grace, Wells said, pointing directly at her as she cleared a nearby table. I want her to play the piano. Now. The restaurant had gone quieter as the night progressed, and several of the remaining diners turned to look. Grace froze, a stack of dirty plates in her hands, feeling her heart begin to race. Thomas laughed nervously. Mr. Wells, our staff is here to serve food, not perform. Perhaps I could arrange for a professional pianist to come in next time you dine with us. Wells reached into his jacket and pulled out a money clip. He peeled off several $100 bills and placed them on the table. This should cover any inconvenience, he said, his tone making it clear he wasn't asking anymore. Grace stood rooted to the spot as Thomas approached her with an apologetic expression. He's insisting, he whispered. And he's one of our most valuable customers. Would you mind? Just one song? Grace looked over at Wells, who was watching her with those penetrating eyes. There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite decipher. Not exactly kindness, but not cruelty either. It was almost like curiosity, or perhaps recognition of something he understood all too well. The few remaining customers were all watching now, the scene unfolding like some strange theater. Grace felt her hands begin to tremble slightly. She had not touched a piano in nearly 8 months. The restaurant had fallen into an uncomfortable silence. Grace stood frozen, a stack of dirty plates still in her hands as every pair of eyes in the room turned toward her. She felt her cheeks flush with heat. This wasn't part of her job. She was here to serve food and drinks, not to perform like some circus animal at the whim of a wealthy customer. I really can't, she whispered to Thomas, who was looking at her with a mix of sympathy and expectation. It's just one song, he replied quietly. Mr. Wells is our most important customer. His party alone tonight will cover half our overhead for the day. He glanced at the stack of $100 bills on the table. And he seems willing to make it worth your while. Grace felt a flicker of anger. Of course, it always came down to money. That's how men like Richard Wells operated. They believed everything and everyone had a price. Her love of music wasn't something that should be bought and sold for someone else's entertainment. She set down the dirty plates on a nearby empty table and wiped her hands on her apron. I need to finish my shift, she said firmly, turning away. Please? Thomas caught her arm gently. Carla can cover your tables. It's almost closing time anyway. His voice dropped even lower. Look, I know this is awkward, but he could make things difficult for all of us if he leaves unhappy. Just one song, then you can go home. Grace looked around the restaurant again. The remaining customers were watching with interest, some whispering to each other. A few had even taken out their phones, ready to record whatever happened next. The last thing she wanted was to end up on someone's social media as the waitress who had a meltdown because a rich guy asked her to play piano. She took a deep breath and slowly walked toward Wells' table. He was sitting calmly, his expression unreadable as he watched her approach. Mr. Wells, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I appreciate your interest, but I haven't played in months. I'm really not prepared to perform. Wells studied her face for a moment. Up close, she could see that his eyes weren't cold as she had first thought. There was something else there, a hint of understanding, perhaps even kindness. It's not a performance, he said quietly. It's just playing. There's a difference. Grace was surprised by his response. She had expected arrogance or dismissal. Why is this so important to you? She asked before she could stop herself. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Let's just say I recognize someone who needs to play almost as much as they need to breathe. He gestured toward the piano. That instrument has been sitting there all night collecting dust while your fingers have been twitching every time you walk past it." He leaned forward slightly. "Am I wrong?" Grace felt exposed, as if this stranger had somehow seen through her carefully constructed walls. She had been so careful not to let her longing show, or so she thought. "One piece," Wells said, his tone gentler now. "Play one piece not for me or anyone else in this room, but for yourself." For a moment, Grace felt the weight of the past year pressing down on her. Her mother's illness, the mounting bills, the exhaustion of working double shifts, and underneath it all, the quiet ache of setting aside the one thing that had always been her refuge. "All right," she said finally. "One piece." A murmur went through the restaurant as Thomas quickly stepped forward to help her remove her apron. She could feel her heart pounding as she walked toward the piano, aware of every eye following her movement. The baby grand stood waiting, its polished black surface gleaming under the restaurant's soft lighting. Grace hadn't even sat at a piano bench in 8 months. Before her mother's diagnosis, she used to play at a small music school where she taught children on weekends. But that had been one of the first things to go when the medical bills started piling up, and she needed to take on more shifts at the restaurant. She approached the piano cautiously, almost reverently, running her fingertips lightly across its closed lid. It was a Steinway, probably worth more than she made in several years. Slowly, she lifted the cover and revealed the keys beneath, pristine white and black, waiting for her touch. As she sat down on the bench, adjusting its height, a familiar calm began to settle over her. This, at least, was something she knew how to do. This was a language she spoke fluently. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, trying to decide what to play. Something showy and technical to impress Wells? Something simple to make sure she didn't make mistakes after so long? Neither option felt right. She opened her eyes and placed her hands on the keys, feeling their cool smoothness beneath her fingertips. And then, without consciously deciding, she began to play the piece that had been in her heart all these months, Debussy's Clair de Lune. The first notes filled the restaurant, tentative at first, like someone testing unfamiliar waters, but within moments muscle memory took over. Her fingers remembered what her mind had been afraid to recall, the delicate dance across the keys, the gentle rise and fall of the melody that mimicked the quiet breathing of someone deeply asleep. She had played this piece for her mother countless times. It was her favorite, the one that always brought a smile to her face even on the worst days of treatment when pain medications made it hard for her to focus on anything else. As Grace played now, she could almost see her mother's face, eyes closed, head swaying slightly with the music. The piece began to build, growing in complexity and emotion. Grace's hands moved with increasing confidence, drawing out sounds that seemed impossible from mere wood and wire and ivory. This was why she had fallen in love with the piano as a child. This magical ability to create something that could touch people's hearts without a single word being spoken. She forgot about the restaurant, about Wells, about the other customers watching. She forgot about the bills and the exhaustion and the worry. For these few precious minutes, there was only the music, pure and perfect and completely hers. As the final notes of Clair de Lune faded into silence, Grace kept her eyes closed for a moment longer, not wanting to break the spell. The restaurant remained perfectly quiet, as if everyone was collectively holding their breath. When she finally looked up, she was startled to see that several more customers had gathered near the piano. An elderly couple stood hand in hand, the woman discreetly wiping away a tear. 2 businessmen who had been arguing over contracts earlier were standing in silent appreciation. Even the kitchen staff had emerged to listen, lined up near the swinging doors that led to the back of the restaurant. And then, as if released from a trance, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping of people being socially appropriate. It was genuine, enthusiastic appreciation. Grace felt a blush rising to her cheeks again, but this time from a complicated mixture of embarrassment and pride. She hadn't played for an audience in so long that she'd forgotten the unique joy that came from sharing music with others. As the applause continued, she glanced over at Wells's table. He wasn't clapping. Instead, he was watching her with an expression that seemed almost sad, though his eyes were bright with something that might have been recognition. She stood up from the bench and gave a small, awkward bow, not sure what else to do. As she turned to go back to work, Wells rose from his seat and approached the piano. "That was Debussy," he said. It wasn't a question, Grace nodded. Claire de Lune. You played it beautifully. His voice was quiet, meant only for her despite the crowd of people still hovering nearby. But you could have chosen something more technically impressive. Why that piece? The question caught her off guard. Most people would have just offered generic compliments. It's my mother's favorite, she answered honestly. I used to play it for her all the time before. She trailed off, not wanting to burden a stranger with her personal struggles. Wells nodded as if he understood everything she wasn't saying. Music is rarely just about the notes, he said. It's about who we play for and why. Thomas appeared at her elbow, beaming with pride as if her playing had somehow been his accomplishment. Mr. Wells, I had no idea we had such talent on our staff. Grace, that was absolutely wonderful. Before Grace could respond, Wells turned to the manager. I'd like to speak with Grace privately. Is there somewhere we could talk? Thomas looked surprised but quickly nodded. Of course, sir. You can use my office. He gestured toward a door near the back of the restaurant. Grace felt a flutter of anxiety. What could this man possibly want to talk to her about? Was this some kind of job offer? She certainly wasn't going to become some rich man's private pianist. If that's what he was thinking, it will only take a few minutes, Wells said, seeming to sense her hesitation. Curiosity won out over caution. All right, she agreed. As they walked toward the manager's office, leaving behind the still murmuring crowd, Grace couldn't help wondering what twist her already unusual evening was about to take. Whatever Wells wanted to say to her, she had a feeling it would be significant. Men like him didn't waste time on meaningless conversations with waitresses. Thomas opened his office door and gestured them inside. Take all the time you need, he said, closing the door behind them as he left. The office was small but neat, with a desk covered in scheduling sheets and inventory lists. A framed review from a local newspaper hung on one wall, proclaiming Bellini's as the crown jewel of the city's fine dining scene. Wells didn't sit down. Instead, he turned to face Grace directly. I have a proposition for you, he said. Grace stood in the manager's office, her heart still racing from playing the piano after so many months. She faced Richard Wells with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The wealthy businessman had just said he had a proposition for her, and her mind raced with possibilities. I'm listening, she said, crossing her arms protectively across her chest. Wells leaned against the desk, his expression thoughtful. That piece you played, Debussy's Claire de Lune, it's not easy. The technical skill required is considerable, but more importantly, you played it with genuine emotion. That can't be taught. He paused, studying her face. Where did you learn to play like that? Grace hadn't expected this question. She had prepared herself for some kind of business offer, not an inquiry into her past. I started lessons when I was 6, she said simply. My mom cleaned houses for wealthy families, and one of them had a piano. Their daughter was taking lessons but hated practicing. A small smile touched her lips at the memory. The mother noticed me watching and offered to let me try. Their piano teacher heard me playing one day and told my mom it would be a crime not to give me proper lessons. He taught me for free until I was old enough for music school. And did you go to music school? Grace's smile faded. I was accepted to the conservatory with a partial scholarship when I was 18. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had just coaxed such beautiful sounds from the piano keys. But my dad got sick that same year. Cancer. The scholarship wasn't enough to cover tuition and help with his medical bills, so I deferred. He died 8 months later, but by then, she shrugged. Life moved on. I started working full-time, helping Mom with the mortgage. The conservatory held my spot for a year, but after that, reality got in the way of talent. Wells finished for her. There was no judgment in his voice, just understanding. Grace looked up, surprised by his perception. Something like that. I still played whenever I could, taught some kids on weekends, did a few recitals at community centers. She hesitated. Then last year, Mom got diagnosed with the same thing that took Dad. History repeating itself, I guess. Wells nodded slowly. That's why you haven't played in months. Working double shifts doesn't leave much time for hobbies, she said, trying to sound casual but not quite managing it. And the piano at our apartment got sold to pay for Mom's first round of treatments. The office fell silent for a moment. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the restaurant winding down for the night. Chairs being pushed in, final bills being settled. Staff calling good night to each other. What if you could help your mother and still pursue your music? Wells asked, breaking the silence. Grace gave him a skeptical look. Is this where you offer me a job playing piano in one of your hotels for minimum wage plus tips? To her surprise, Wells actually laughed, a genuine sound that momentarily transformed his serious face. No, he said, shaking his head. Nothing like that. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, turning it over and writing something on the back before handing it to her. Grace took it hesitantly. The front was simple and elegant. Richard Wells, CEO, Wells Development Group. On the back he had written an address and a time. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. What is this? She asked, looking up from the card. That address is the home of Philip Chen, the director of the conservatory's piano department. He's an old friend, and he owes me more than one favor. Wells straightened up from the desk. I called him while you were playing. He's agreed to meet with you tomorrow morning. Grace felt a surge of conflicting emotions, hope, confusion, suspicion. Why would you do this? You don't even know me. Wells was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. Finally, he spoke in a voice that had lost some of its commanding edge. My wife was a concert pianist. She died 3 years ago. He met Grace's eyes directly. The last piece she ever performed in public was Claire de Lune. Grace didn't know how to respond to this unexpected revelation. When I heard you play tonight, Wells continued, it reminded me of her. Not just the piece, but the way you played it. Like the music was coming from somewhere deep inside you. He looked away briefly. Since she died, I've funded scholarships for talented musicians. It's what she would have wanted. I'm sorry about your wife, Grace said softly. But I'm 28, not some child prodigy. And I have responsibilities, my mother's treatments, our rent. The scholarship covers full tuition and a monthly stipend, Wells said matter-of-factly. Enough to help with your mother's care while you study. All Chen needs to do is confirm that your talent warrants the investment. He gestured toward the piano out in the restaurant. Based on what I just heard, that shouldn't be a problem. Grace stared at him, trying to process what was happening. After years of putting her dreams on hold, could it really be this simple? One chance encounter with a wealthy stranger and suddenly doors were opening? It seemed too good to be true. Why me? She asked finally. There are probably hundreds of talented musicians out there who could use your help. Wells smiled slightly. Probably. But they weren't the ones playing my late wife's favorite piece in my favorite restaurant tonight. He moved toward the door. Sometimes life comes down to being in the right place at the right time. This is your moment if you want to take it. And if I don't show up tomorrow? Grace asked, still hesitant to believe that such an opportunity could come without strings attached. Then you continue your life exactly as it was. Wells replied with a shrug. No pressure, no obligations. But I hope you'll at least meet with Chen. He opened the office door. Your playing is a gift, Grace. Not just to yourself, but to anyone who hears it. With that, he left, walking back through the now nearly empty restaurant and out the front door without another word. Grace stood in the office doorway, the business card still in her hand, watching as he disappeared into the night. Thomas hurried over, his face alight with curiosity. What was that all about? What did he say to you? Grace hardly heard him. Her mind was racing, thoughts tumbling over each other. Could she really go back to school after all these years? What about her mother? Would this mysterious scholarship really cover enough to help with her care? And how could she trust the word of a man she had just met, no matter how wealthy or well-connected he might be? Grace? Thomas prompted when she didn't respond. She blinked, coming back to reality. He wants me to meet with the director of the conservatory's piano department tomorrow. Something about a scholarship. Thomas's eyes widened. Are you serious? That's incredible. He looked at her with new respect, as if seeing her for the first time. I had no idea you could play like that. You're wasted here serving food. Several of Grace's co-workers had gathered nearby, having overheard the conversation. Carla, who had covered Grace's tables during her impromptu performance, gave her an encouraging smile. You should definitely go, she said. What have you got to lose? Grace nodded slowly, the initial shock beginning to wear off. What did she have to lose? A few hours of her time at most. And if Wells was telling the truth, if this scholarship was real... I need to get home, she said suddenly, remembering her mother. The night nurse only stays until 11. Go, Thomas said, waving her away. We can handle closing up. Just make sure you're at that meeting tomorrow. And I want to hear all about it when you come in for your shift." Grace quickly gathered her things and left through the back door, her mind still reeling from the evening's events. The cool night air felt good against her skin as she hurried toward the bus stop. She had taken this same route hundreds of times after closing shifts, but tonight everything felt different, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis. The bus was nearly empty at this late hour. As she sat looking out the window at the passing city lights, Grace took out Wells's business card again, running her finger over the embossed letters of his name and the handwritten address on the back. Could this really be happening? After years of watching her dreams recede further and further into the distance, was there suddenly a chance to reclaim them? She thought about her mother, who had always been her biggest supporter. Even now, weakened by treatments and often in pain, she would ask Grace if she had found time to play, her eyes lighting up at any mention of music. How many times had she told Grace not to give up, that someday things would work out? As the bus rumbled through the quiet streets, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Hope. Not the cautious, practical hope of making it through another day or paying another bill, but the kind of expansive hope that made her feel like she could breathe fully for the first time in years. By the time she reached her stop, she had made up her mind. She would go to the meeting tomorrow. She would play for Philip Chen and show him everything she could do. And if this scholarship was real, if this chance was genuine, she would take it with both hands and hold on tight. Grace unlocked the door to the small apartment she shared with her mother, trying to be quiet in case she was already asleep. To her surprise, she found her mother sitting up in the living room, a book open on her lap. "You're still awake," Grace said, setting down her bag. "Is everything okay? Did Lisa leave on time?" Her mother smiled, the lines of her face deepening. Despite the toll that illness and treatment had taken, there was still a spark of life in her eyes that refused to be dimmed. "Everything's fine," she said. "I just wasn't tired yet." She marked her place in the book and set it aside. "How was work?" Grace sat down next to her, suddenly bursting with the need to share what had happened. "Mom," she said, taking her mother's thin hand, "you won't believe what happened tonight." The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the conservatory's main building. Grace sat on a bench in the hallway, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. All around her, students hurried past with instrument cases and sheet music, their conversations and laughter echoing off the marble floors and high ceilings. She had been here once before, 10 years ago when she first auditioned for admission. The building hadn't changed much. The same imposing stone exterior, the same portraits of famous musicians lining the walls, the same feeling of history and tradition in every corner. But Grace had changed, and she couldn't help wondering if she was making a fool of herself by being here now. After telling her mother everything last night, about playing the piano at the restaurant, about Richard Wells and his unexpected offer, she had barely slept. Her mother, despite her weakened state, had been ecstatic, insisting that Grace must go to the meeting, must take this chance. "It's what your father would have wanted," she had said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It's what I've always wanted for you." So here she was, dressed in the nicest clothes she owned, which weren't very nice at all compared to what the students around her were wearing, waiting to meet with Philip Chen, the director of the piano department. The same Philip Chen whose recordings she had listened to obsessively as a teenager, whose interpretations of Chopin had moved her to tears, whose master classes were legendary for their difficulty and insight. Grace checked her watch again. 9:55 a.m. She had arrived ridiculously early, too nervous to risk being late. Wells had said Chen would meet her at 10 gauss, but what if he didn't show up? What if this whole thing was some elaborate joke or misunderstanding? "Excuse me," a voice interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Are you Grace?" She looked up to see a young man with glasses and a friendly smile. "Yes," she said, standing quickly. "I'm Dr. Chen's assistant," he said, extending his hand. "He's ready for you now. Please follow me." Grace followed him down a long hallway lined with practice rooms. Through each door she could hear snippets of music, scales and arpeggios, fragments of sonatas, a Bach fugue played with meticulous precision. The sounds both comforted and intimidated her. This was a world she had once desperately wanted to be part of, a world that had seemed forever closed to her until last night. The assistant stopped at a door marked Philip Chen, Piano department director, and knocked softly. A voice from within called, "Come in," and the assistant opened the door, gesturing for Grace to enter. The office was large and airy, with bookshelves lining one wall and large windows overlooking the conservatory's courtyard on another. In the center of the room stood a magnificent grand piano, a Bösendorfer, even more impressive than the Steinway at the restaurant. And seated at a desk near the windows was Philip Chen himself. He was smaller than Grace had imagined from his recordings and the few videos she had seen of his performances. In his 60s now, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he had the quiet, concentrated presence of someone who lived most deeply in the world of sound. "Miss Grace," he said, rising to greet her. His voice was accented but clear, his handshake firm. "Please sit down." He gestured to a chair across from his desk. As Grace sat, trying to calm her racing heart, Chen studied her with keen eyes. "So you are Richard's mysterious discovery," he said with the hint of a smile. "He called me quite late last night, insisting that I must meet with you immediately." It's not like him to be so enthusiastic about a musician. He appreciates music, of course, but since his wife passed away... He trailed off, then straightened in his chair. "Well, he was quite insistent that you have exceptional talent." "Mr. Wells was very kind," Grace said carefully. "But I haven't had proper training in years, and I'm out of practice." "I don't want to waste your time," Chen nodded thoughtfully. "Honesty. That's good. Many young musicians come here full of arrogance, thinking they already know everything." He gestured toward the piano. "Shall we see what you can do?" Grace stood and moved to the piano, her legs feeling suddenly weak. As she sat on the bench and adjusted its height, she tried to quiet the doubt screaming in her mind. What was she doing here? She hadn't played seriously in years. She was going to embarrass herself in front of one of the greatest piano teachers in the country. "What would you like me to play?" she asked, surprised at how steady her voice sounded. Chen considered for a moment. "Richard mentioned you played Debussy last night. Perhaps something different now. Do you know any Bach?" Grace nodded. Bach had been her first love, the composer whose complex, mathematical precision had captured her heart, even before she understood what made his music so special. The Prelude and Fugue in C minor, perhaps, from the Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1. It was a challenging piece, with the fugue particularly known for its technical demands. Grace had learned it years ago and had practiced it obsessively until each voice sang with perfect clarity. But that had been a long time ago. Could her fingers still remember? Only one way to find out. She placed her hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first few measures of the prelude were tentative, her fingers finding their way back to familiar patterns, but soon the music began to take over, and she felt herself falling into the rhythm and flow of Bach's intricate architecture. By the time she reached the fugue, she was fully immersed, conscious only of the interweaving voices and the story they were telling. When she finished, the office was completely silent. Grace kept her eyes on the keys, afraid to look up and see disappointment on Chen's face. "You have never studied here?" he asked after a long moment. Grace shook her head. "I was accepted 10 years ago, but never enrolled." "And since then? No formal training?" "No," she admitted. "Just what I learned before and what I taught myself." She finally looked up. "I know it wasn't perfect. The middle section of the fugue especially. I rushed it and there were some missed notes in the left hand." Chen's expression was unreadable. He walked to the piano and stood beside it, his fingers lightly touching its polished surface. "Technical errors can be corrected with practice," he said. "What cannot be taught is the understanding of the music, the ability to hear how each voice relates to the others, to feel the architecture." He looked at her directly now. "You have that understanding. It's rare, even among our students who have studied for years." Grace felt a flush of pleasure at his words, but still the doubts lingered. "Mr. Wells mentioned something about a scholarship," she said hesitantly. Chen returned to his desk and picked up a folder. "Yes, the Eleanor Wells Memorial Scholarship. It was established 3 years ago after Richard's wife died. Full tuition, plus a stipend for living expenses." He opened the folder and glanced at its contents. "It's usually awarded through our normal application process, but as the founder, Richard has the right to recommend candidates for special consideration." He set the folder down and looked at Grace seriously. "I will be honest with you. At 28, you would be older than most of our students. Your technical skills, while impressive given your lack of formal training, would need significant work to reach the level we expect." He paused. "However, I heard something in your playing just now that cannot be taught. The question is whether you are willing to put in the work to develop the rest." Grace felt a complex mix of emotions: hope, fear, determination. "I am," she said simply. "If I'm given the chance, I'll work harder than anyone." Chen studied her for another long moment, then nodded. "Very well. I will need to hear you play a full program. Bach, something classical, something romantic, and a contemporary piece. Can you prepare that within a week?" Grace's heart leapt. This was real. This was actually happening. "Yes," she said, trying to keep the tremor of excitement from her voice. "Absolutely. Good. My assistant will give you the details on your way out." Chen stood, signaling that the meeting was over. "And Grace," he added as she rose to leave, "Richard rarely makes mistakes about people. If he believes in your talent, there must be something special there. Don't prove him wrong." The week that followed was a blur of activity. Grace arranged time off from the restaurant, explaining to a delighted Thomas that she needed to prepare for an audition at the conservatory. She practiced for hours each day on the old upright piano at a community center near her apartment, working through the program she had selected: the Bach she had played for Chen, Mozart's Sonata in C minor, Chopin's Ballade No. 1, and a piece by Philip Glass. Her mother, though weakened by her treatments, insisted on listening whenever Grace practiced at home on their newly rented keyboard, a gift from her co-workers at the restaurant, who had taken up a collection when they heard her news. "It's like having the old you back," her mother said, her eyes bright with tears of joy. The you that was always meant to be. The day of the audition arrived with startling swiftness. Grace performed in a small recital hall before a panel that included Chen and 2 other faculty members. She played with everything she had, pouring all her years of deferred dreams and quiet persistence into each note. When it was over, she waited in that same hallway where she had sat a week earlier, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. After what seemed like an eternity, Chen emerged from the recital hall. "The committee has made its decision," he said, his face giving nothing away. Then slowly he smiled. "We would like to offer you the Eleanor Wells Memorial Scholarship, beginning with the fall semester." Grace couldn't speak. All she could do was nod, tears filling her eyes as the reality of what was happening washed over her. "There's someone else who would like to congratulate you," Chen added, gesturing toward the end of the hallway. Grace turned to see Richard Wells approaching, his usually stern face softened with what might have been satisfaction. "I told you Chen would see your talent," he said as he reached them. "How does it feel to be returning to the path you were meant for?" "Overwhelming," Grace admitted. "I still can't quite believe it's real, and I'm worried about my mother. Even with the stipend, her care is expensive and I won't be able to work as much once classes start." Wells and Chen exchanged a glance. "There's something else," Wells said. "The scholarship includes health insurance that can cover dependents. Your mother will be able to receive treatment here, at the university hospital. Some of the best oncologists in the country work there." Grace stared at him, unable to process this additional gift. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do all this for a stranger?" Wells was quiet for a moment. "My wife was a lot like you," he said finally. Talented, determined, but held back by circumstances beyond her control. Someone took a chance on her once, made it possible for her to study music when her family couldn't afford it. His eyes met Grace's. "Before she died, she made me promise to do the same for others. This scholarship was her idea, her legacy." "I don't know how to thank you," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "Play," Wells said simply. "Study. Become the musician you were meant to be. That's all the thanks I need." 6 months later, Grace gave her first recital as a conservatory student. The small performance hall was filled with fellow students, faculty members, and friends from the restaurant where she still worked 1 night a week, to keep herself grounded, as she put it. In the front row sat her mother, looking stronger than she had in months, the new treatments at the university hospital having slowed the progression of her disease. Beside her was Richard Wells, his usually stern face softened as he listened to the music. Grace had chosen to end her program with Claire de Lune, the piece that had changed her life on that fateful night at the restaurant. As the final notes faded into silence, she looked out at the audience, at her mother's proud smile, At her friend's enthusiastic applause, at Wells's quiet nod of approval, she had finally found her way back to where she belonged. The journey had been longer and more difficult than she could have imagined when she first sat down at a piano as a child. But somehow, against all odds, she had arrived. And as she stood to take her bow, Grace knew with absolute certainty that this was just the beginning.